I need space from this marriage, she told me with cold certainty, her eyes not even flickering toward mine. That single sentence felt like a hammer against the foundation of everything I thought we had built together. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't beg for her to reconsider. Instead, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Pack tonight. You'll have plenty." That was the moment everything shifted, the line where confusion gave way to clarity, and the story of how my marriage unraveled truly began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus, and for the longest time, I believed I had done everything right in my marriage to Eleanor. We lived in a quiet suburb outside of Raleigh, in a 2-story brick house that I worked long hours to afford. I had grown up with parents who fought endlessly, so when I finally settled down, my promise to myself was that I would build a life where love felt safe, steady, and real. And for a while, I believed that was exactly what Eleanor and I had. We met during a charity fundraiser organized by one of her college friends. I remember being drawn to her wit, her warm smile, and the way she seemed to light up the room without even trying. She had this confidence, this air of independence, that made me want to be around her constantly. She was an architect just starting her career, and I was already working my way up in logistics management. Different worlds, but we fit. Or at least I thought we did. The night she told me she needed space wasn't filled with shouting or slammed doors. It was calm, almost too calm, as though she had been rehearsing it in her head for weeks. She sat at the edge of the sofa, legs crossed, hands folded, speaking in a tone that was so measured it almost didn't feel real. "I think we've grown apart," she said. "I need time to figure out who I am without all of this structure." Structure. That's what she called our marriage, what I had spent nearly a decade of my life trying to nurture and protect. My first instinct was shock, then anger threatened to rise, but instead, I took a deep breath and realized something. If she was truly asking for space, it wasn't a plea for time, it was a declaration that she had already left us in her mind. That's why my response was immediate and firm. "Pack tonight. You'll have plenty." She blinked, surprised, maybe even offended, but I meant every word. The irony is that just months earlier, I never would have imagined myself saying something like that. Back then, I still clung to the belief that Eleanor and I were strong, unshakable. We had our routines, Sunday morning coffee runs, late-night Netflix binges after long workdays, the occasional spontaneous trip when we could both clear our schedules. We weren't perfect, but I thought we were steady. I thought that was enough. Apparently, she thought otherwise. Looking back now, I can trace faint cracks in the picture I painted of us, moments I brushed aside because I didn't want to believe they meant anything. But those small signs were only the beginning, and sitting in that living room, staring at Eleanor as she carefully explained her need for space, I realized all at once how blind I had been. Still, let me take you back to before that night, to who I was before my world flipped upside down. I was the kind of husband who prided himself on dependability. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't spontaneous in the way Eleanor sometimes seemed to crave, but I was there. I was loyal. I thought that mattered more than anything else. I built my life on showing up, paying the bills, fixing what needed fixing, and making sure she never had to worry about stability. Eleanor used to tell me that was one of the reasons she fell for me, because I wasn't like the other men she had dated, men who chased dreams without a plan or lived recklessly without thinking about tomorrow. With me, she said, tomorrow always felt secure. I believed her. I believed we were aligned. But now, as I sit here telling this story, I see that what Eleanor wanted wasn't the stability I was so proud of, it was the freedom to chase something else entirely, something I couldn't give her no matter how hard I tried. The night she asked for space was just the final scene in a play that had been written long before. I see that now, but in the moment, all I could feel was a strange mix of anger, sadness, and liberation. Anger that she didn't value what we had. Sadness that I had invested so much of myself into someone who wanted to walk away. And liberation, because her words gave me the clarity I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Instead of dragging myself through months of confusion, trying to fix what she had already decided was broken, I could finally let go. Of course, letting go isn't simple. The story of how I got there, of how Eleanor and I reached that night where she told me she needed space and I told her she'd have plenty, begins long before the conversation itself. It starts in the early days, when everything between us felt effortless, when laughter filled our home and every problem seemed small. It stretches through the moments I ignored, the times she came home later than usual, the increasing number of nights she spent glued to her phone, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. It builds through the friends who pulled me aside and told me I needed to open my eyes, that something was shifting beneath the surface. It crescendos at the night when she spoke her truth, and I finally spoke mine back. And from that point on, there was no going back. So when Eleanor looked at me with that calm, rehearsed face and said, "I need space from this marriage," she thought I'd beg or bargain, maybe even cry. But instead, I gave her something she didn't expect. I gave her freedom. I gave her space. More space than she ever imagined. And that's when the story really began. Before Eleanor ever uttered those words that ended everything, my life felt almost predictable, and to me, predictable meant safe. I had spent my childhood in a home where nothing ever was. My parents, Gerald and Ruth, were known in our neighborhood for the constant shouting that poured out of their house at all hours. I would wake to slammed doors, muffled sobs, and the kind of cutting words a child should never hear. By the time I was 12, I had learned that stability was the most precious currency in a relationship, far more valuable than passion or adventure. That belief shaped everything about me as I grew into adulthood. When I went off to college, I worked 3 jobs to afford my tuition and textbooks because I refused to rely on anyone else. Dependability, I decided, would be the foundation of my life. And when I met Eleanor, that's exactly what I offered her. We lived in a modest but comfortable home in a quiet subdivision called Maplewood Estates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, purchased after years of budgeting and careful planning. I can still remember the first day we stepped inside, Eleanor running her hand over the kitchen counters and declaring it our forever place. That phrase stuck with me. It fueled every extra hour I worked, every repair project I tackled, every time I resisted the temptation to spend money frivolously. I wanted to give her the forever she had envisioned. That was my mindset in everything: provide, protect, preserve. Our neighbors often saw me outside mowing the lawn, painting the fence, or fixing the gutters while Eleanor worked late nights on her architectural drafts. People would comment on how dedicated we seemed, how solid we looked compared to the couples who lived around us. I took pride in those comments, thinking they validated what I had built. Eleanor herself was ambitious and fiercely intelligent, with a knack for designing spaces that seemed to blend creativity with practicality. Early in our marriage, she would show me her sketches late at night, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she explained the concepts. She dreamed of designing an entire community one day, a collection of homes that felt welcoming, warm, and functional. I admired that in her, and I often told her I was proud. In return, she would smile, kiss me on the cheek, and say she couldn't do it without my support. Those moments were small, but they became my definition of what marriage was supposed to be: 2 people working toward different goals but relying on one another for strength. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our daily life was simple but structured. I would leave the house by 7 each morning, driving into the city for my job at a logistics firm. My work revolved around ensuring goods moved efficiently from warehouses to retailers, not glamorous but stable, and it paid well enough to keep us comfortable. Eleanor's schedule was less predictable, with client meetings, late-night drafting sessions, and occasional site visits that pulled her away at odd hours. Still, we found our rhythm. We had dinner together at least 4 nights a week, often cooking simple meals side by side, music playing softly in the background. On Fridays, we would order takeout from a local Thai place and watch whatever series we were hooked on at the time. Sundays were our day for errands, groceries, laundry, catching up on small chores. It wasn't a whirlwind romance filled with grand gestures, but it was a life I thought we both wanted. Looking back, I realize Eleanor thrived on stimulation and change in ways I didn't. She was the type to suggest spontaneous road trips, last-minute dinner parties, or unusual weekend projects like trying to build furniture from scratch. I would sometimes humor her, but more often than not, I would gently redirect us to something more practical. Let's plan it out first, I'd say, or maybe we should wait until we've saved a little more. I thought I was being responsible. I thought she appreciated my level-headedness. And maybe for a while she did. But over time, I wonder if she started to see it as boring, as suffocating. In her eyes, I was reliable, yes, but maybe too reliable, too unwilling to deviate from the steady path I had carved. Still, in those early years, it worked. We traveled a little when we could, mostly short trips, Charleston, Savannah, the mountains and Asheville. We laughed together, celebrated birthdays with friends, exchanged thoughtful gifts on anniversaries. She once surprised me with a watch I still wear today, engraved with the words "For the man who makes me feel safe." That meant something to me. It was proof I was fulfilling the role I had always promised myself I'd embody. I wanted to be her anchor. I thought she wanted to be anchored. Our social circle was fairly small but meaningful. We had a few close friends, Greg and Melissa, a couple who lived 2 streets over, often came by for barbecues. My younger sister, Camille, visited us often, sometimes staying the weekend. Eleanor's best friend, Clara, was always in the picture too, a whirlwind of energy and opinions who never shied away from speaking her mind. At the time, I didn't think much of the way Clara teased Eleanor about being tied down too young, brushing it off as harmless banter. Now, with hindsight, I wonder if Clara's words planted seeds that Eleanor later watered. Either way, the people around us saw what we allowed them to see, a marriage that looked dependable and steady. I was proud of that steadiness. Proud that we didn't fight often, proud that I never raised my voice, proud that Eleanor never had to worry about rent or bills or broken promises. To me, that was the essence of love, not chaos, not drama, not constant passion, but commitment. It wasn't until much later that I realized Eleanor defined love differently. She craved novelty, freedom, exploration. She wanted a partner who could match her in spontaneity, not just in stability. But at this stage of the story, I didn't know any of that. I believed we were aligned. I believed that what I was giving was enough. That's why her request for space blindsided me the way it did. From my perspective, I was the husband who had lived up to every vow. I had given her a home, security, loyalty, and consistency. I had worked overtime, sacrificed weekends, passed up luxuries, all to build a future we had once described as ours. So when she looked me in the eyes and told me she needed something else, something away from me, it wasn't just a betrayal of marriage, it was a betrayal of the very principles I had built my life on. But that realization would come later. At this point, I was still firmly convinced that we were strong, that our marriage was built on a foundation that couldn't be shaken. How wrong I was. The story of how Eleanor and I began feels like it belongs to an entirely different lifetime, almost like recalling the details of a novel I once loved but no longer recognize myself in. We met at a fundraiser hosted by one of her college friends, a lively evening at an art gallery in downtown Durham. I hadn't planned on attending. I was there as a favor to a colleague who wanted extra company at his table. The night was filled with polite chatter and glasses of red wine, but nothing truly captured my attention until I noticed her. Eleanor stood near a display of abstract paintings, animatedly discussing design with a small group, her hands moving with the kind of precision that suggested she truly lived through her work. She was magnetic in a way that drew people in without her trying. I remember thinking that she looked entirely in her element, confident, radiant, and somehow approachable despite the circle of admirers around her. When we were finally introduced, I found myself fumbling through small talk while she regarded me with curious eyes. Logistics, she repeated when I explained what I did for a living. So you're the person making sure the rest of us actually get what we order on time. She grinned, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, that small spark of humor disarmed me. Unlike others I had met, Eleanor didn't act as though my career was dull or beneath her interest. Instead, she leaned in, asked questions, and listened with genuine attention. Later that night, when the fundraiser wound down, we ended up walking outside together, her heels clicking softly on the pavement while we searched for our cars. I offered to walk her to hers, and what I thought would be a brief exchange stretched into nearly an hour of conversation by the sidewalk. We discovered that despite our very different professions, we both valued structure in our own ways. She thrived on designing spaces with purpose, where people could feel comfortable and connected, while I thrived on ensuring that things moved where they needed to be with efficiency and reliability. She told me she admired people who were steady, people who didn't cave under pressure, and I admitted that I admired people with vision and creativity, qualities she seemed to embody effortlessly. Before parting ways, I asked if she'd like to have dinner sometime, and to my relief, she agreed. That first dinner turned into coffee the following week, then movie nights, then road trips, until the line between her world and mine blurred into one life. In the early days, everything felt light, exciting, even intoxicating. I wasn't used to someone as bold as Eleanor. She challenged me in ways that made me feel both invigorated and slightly off balance. If I hesitated about doing something spontaneous, like joining her for a midnight drive to the coast just to watch the sunrise, she'd coax me into it with that knowing smile. "You'll thank me later," she'd say, and often, she was right. Those nights, sitting by the shore with her head on my shoulder, I thought I had stumbled into something extraordinary. It wasn't just that I was in love with her, it was that she made me see life differently, as if the world had more color, more vibrancy, more possibility than I had allowed myself to believe. It didn't take long for me to fall deeply, and when I did, I fell completely. I began to imagine a future with Eleanor almost immediately. What surprised me was how quickly she seemed to imagine the same. Within a year, we were talking seriously about marriage, about what we wanted out of life, about how we would balance her architectural ambitions with my career stability. She admitted she feared losing her independence, but she also said she wanted to build something lasting with me. I reassured her that I admired her drive and would never stand in the way of her goals. At the time, it felt like we had found a perfect compromise, her fire and my steadiness, her creativity and my reliability. I believed we balanced each other out in a way that promised longevity. Our wedding was small but heartfelt. Held in the garden of a local inn, we stood beneath an archway of flowers while a few dozen friends and family members gathered. I can still picture the way she looked walking down that aisle, her eyes locked on mine, her smile radiant and sure. She whispered her vows with conviction, promising to love me through every change, every storm, every quiet moment in between. I took those words to heart, believing that we were laying down roots that would grow stronger year after year. For me, the wedding wasn't just a ceremony, it was a declaration that I had finally escaped the chaos of my parents' marriage. This was my chance to rewrite that story, to prove that stability and love could coexist. In the years immediately following our vows, I thought we were unstoppable. We traveled when we could afford it, sometimes just short weekend trips, but each one felt like an adventure. We started traditions, Sunday brunches at a cafe downtown, movie marathons in the fall, long walks in the neighborhood after dinner when the weather was nice. Eleanor filled our home with plants and bright accents, little touches of her personality in every corner. I found myself taking pride in building a home with her, in providing the structure where her creativity could flourish. Every paycheck I deposited, every overtime shift I worked, I framed as an investment in our shared dream. Of course, there were small signs even then, but I didn't see them for what they were. Eleanor sometimes complained that I didn't push her out of her comfort zone as much as she pushed me. She teased that I was too practical, too grounded, too unwilling to leap without a plan. I laughed it off, promising that she brought enough spontaneity for the both of us. At the time, those comments felt harmless, almost playful. I never imagined they would foreshadow deeper dissatisfaction brewing beneath the surface. I was too caught up in the narrative I had built in my head, that we were partners destined to last. Looking back now, the beginning feels like a dream that was almost too perfect, a setup for the fall that was waiting around the corner. We were two people caught up in the illusion that love alone could bridge the gap between our differences. I thought stability would be enough to sustain her, and she thought her spark would be enough to keep me engaged. For a while, it seemed to work. But beginnings, no matter how bright, don't always predict the ending. And the ending, when it came, would be nothing like the fairy tale start I once believed in. The good times with Eleanor are the moments that still linger in my memory, not with bitterness but with a strange sense of disbelief, like snapshots from a life that doesn't belong to me anymore. They were the chapters that made me believe we were invincible, the periods where everything flowed easily and naturally, and where I thought our love was proof that I had finally broken free from the chaos I grew up around. These were the times I thought would last forever, the foundation I was certain we could always fall back on no matter what storms came our way. The first few years of our marriage felt almost charmed. We were both working hard but still young enough to find excitement in even the smallest victories. I remember when Eleanor landed her first big architectural project with a boutique hotel in Charlotte. She came home that evening bursting through the front door with her arms full of rolled-up blueprints, her cheeks flushed with triumph. I had never seen her so exhilarated. We stayed up half the night with takeout containers scattered across the coffee table as she explained her designs to me, pacing the living room with her hands waving through the air to illustrate her ideas. I didn't understand half of the technical terms, but I nodded along, asked questions, and encouraged her. When she finally collapsed onto the couch, laughing at her own exhaustion, she looked at me with this gratefulness in her eyes that made me feel 10 feet tall. "I couldn't do this without you," she whispered. Moments like that made me feel indispensable, like I was the anchor that allowed her to soar. At the same time, my own career was blossoming. I had worked my way into a managerial role, overseeing a team of people who trusted me and respected the way I handled problems calmly. Eleanor would sometimes joke that I was the logistics wizard, the one who could solve any crisis with a whiteboard and a clear head. She would brag about me to her friends, calling me the most reliable man she knew. Hearing her speak so proudly about me made me believe I was exactly the husband she wanted, exactly the man she had envisioned building a life with. We carved out joy in the little things. Saturday mornings became sacred. We'd walk down to a local bakery, share a pastry, and sip coffee while planning the weekend ahead. In the evenings, we'd sit on our back porch, watching the fireflies flicker across the yard as summer stretched long into the night. Eleanor loved those moments, when the world seemed to slow down, and I loved them because they reminded me how simple happiness could be. We started hosting dinners for friends, too, Eleanor showing off her culinary experiments while I manned the grill. The house would fill with laughter, glasses clinking, music playing softly in the background. People would leave late, thanking us for such warmth, and as we cleaned up the mess together, she'd smile at me and say, "We make a good team." I believe that with every fiber of my being. Traveling with Eleanor was another highlight of those golden years. We weren't wealthy, but we saved diligently for short getaways. A trip to New Orleans stands out the most. Eleanor had been fascinated by the city's blend of cultures, architecture, and history, and when we finally made the trip, she lit up like a child in a candy store. We wandered the French Quarter, sampling beignets, listening to live jazz, and ducking into antique shops. One evening, we sat on a balcony overlooking Bourbon Street, and she turned to me with that mischievous sparkle in her eyes. "Can you believe this is our life?" she asked. I squeezed her hand and said I could, and I meant it. Those trips weren't extravagant, but they were ours, and each one felt like a reaffirmation of our bond. Holidays carried their own magic. Christmas was her favorite, and Eleanor would transform our home into what looked like a magazine spread. She insisted on stringing lights around every corner, setting up candles, and baking enough cookies to feed a small army. I'd tease her about overdoing it, but secretly I loved how much joy she took in the season. On Christmas Eve, we'd sit by the tree exchanging small gifts, often handmade or deeply personal. One year, she gave me a scrapbook she'd been working on for months, filled with photos, ticket stubs, and handwritten notes about our adventures. I remember flipping through it with tears stinging my eyes, overwhelmed by the love she had poured into it. "This is our story," she said softly. I thought she meant it forever. It wasn't only about the grand occasions, even our ordinary days felt extraordinary when things were good. There was comfort in our routines, cooking dinner side by side, her humming absent-mindedly while she chopped vegetables, me pouring us glasses of wine, lying in bed on lazy Sunday mornings, tangled in sheets, talking about everything and nothing, the way she'd rest her head on my chest during movies, her breathing steady and content. These moments were my proof that marriage could be peaceful, fulfilling, and safe. I carried them like precious stones, tucking them away in my heart as evidence that I had succeeded where my parents had failed. Of course, the outside world only saw the highlight reel, and I was proud to let them. Friends envied our connection. Family praised our steadiness. Neighbors looked at us as an example of what a strong marriage could be. And I believed every word. I believed the laughter, the travels, the traditions, and the shared dreams were enough to insulate us from whatever difficulties might come. I believed love plus commitment equaled permanence. The truth, which I can only admit now, is that the good times were both beautiful and deceptive. They blinded me. They created a sense of security so strong that I failed to notice the subtle undercurrents pulling beneath the surface. At the time, though, I didn't care about undercurrents. I was too wrapped up in the glow of those golden years. I thought we had built something that would withstand anything. And that certainty, that naive certainty, would make the warning signs, when they came, hit me like a storm I never saw coming. The first cracks in our marriage didn't appear as explosions or betrayals. They came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like hairline fractures in glass that only become visible when the light hits just right. At first, I didn't even recognize them as warning signs. I told myself we were simply going through phases, that every couple experiences periods of distance or friction. But in hindsight, those early moments were the whispers of a truth I wasn't ready to hear. The first change I noticed was Eleanor's increasing restlessness at home. She had always been the more adventurous one between us, the dreamer who loved spontaneity, but suddenly her desire for novelty felt relentless. She wanted to redecorate entire rooms on a whim, to take weekend trips when our budget couldn't reasonably support them, to sign up for cooking classes, dance classes, yoga retreats, all at once. At first, I tried to indulge her when I could, but as the demands piled up, I found myself saying no more often. "We should probably save," I would explain. "Maybe next month." Each time, she'd smile tightly, but I could sense the disappointment simmering beneath her skin. Then came the late nights. Eleanor's job had always required long hours, but it reached a point where I'd come home to an empty house more often than not. She'd send a quick text, "Don't wait up, still drafting." At first, I believed her without hesitation, proud of her dedication. But over time, the texts grew shorter, less personal, almost mechanical. Busy. Later. Meeting. Deadline. When she did come home, she often seemed distracted, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She'd sit on the couch scrolling through her phone, her laughter muted as she responded to messages I wasn't privy to. If I asked who she was talking to, she'd casually brush it off. "Just Clara, or a colleague." I wanted to believe her, and so I did, but a quiet unease began to take root inside me. The physical closeness we once shared started to shift as well. Where we had once curled up on the couch together, she began sitting on the opposite end, her legs tucked beneath her, her focus on her screen or a book. In bed, she'd roll to her side with her back to me, claiming she was too tired for intimacy. At first, I chalked it up to stress. I told myself it was temporary, that her project deadlines were draining her. But the distance persisted. It was like living with a roommate who happened to share my last name, rather than the woman I had once whispered vows to. And though I tried not to take it personally, I felt the sting of rejection each time I reached for her and she gently pulled away. Friends began to notice subtle shifts too. Greg, my neighbor and close friend, mentioned one evening during a barbecue that Eleanor seemed different lately. He tried to frame it casually, but his concern was evident. "She's quieter, you know? Not as present," he said while flipping burgers on the grill. I laughed it off, told him she was just tired from work, but his words stuck with me. Later that week, my sister Camille pulled me aside during a family dinner and asked, "Is everything okay with you two?" She barely talked to me tonight. I brushed her off as well, insisting everything was fine, but deep down I knew their observations aligned with my own private fears. Eleanor was slipping away, inch by inch, and I was the only one pretending not to notice. Arguments began creeping into our home in ways they never had before. They weren't screaming matches, but sharp, clipped exchanges that left invisible bruises. She would criticize the way I always played it safe, how I never wanted to take risks or live a little. I'd counter that stability wasn't a flaw, that someone had to keep us grounded. She'd accuse me of stifling her spirit, and I'd accuse her of being reckless with money or time. These weren't massive fights, but they chipped away at our foundation, each one leaving behind a residue of resentment that neither of us addressed properly. We'd go to bed in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of us. The biggest warning sign, though, was emotional withdrawal. Eleanor used to tell me everything, her dreams, her frustrations, her insecurities. But slowly, she stopped confiding in me. When she came home after a long day, instead of venting about her clients or coworkers, she'd shrug and say, "It's fine, nothing worth talking about." When I tried to share my own work struggles, she'd nod absently, barely listening, her attention elsewhere. The intimacy of communication, the lifeline of any marriage, was slipping through our fingers. And I, terrified of pushing her further away, didn't press harder. I convinced myself that giving her space was the answer, that she'd come back around if I was just patient enough. One particular evening stands out in my mind. We had planned a simple dinner together, something we hadn't done in weeks. I cooked her favorite pasta, lit a couple of candles, tried to recreate the warmth of our earlier days. She came home late, clearly irritated, and barely touched her food. When I asked what was wrong, she sighed heavily and said, "Marcus, I just feel suffocated." "Can't you see that?" My heart sank. Suffocated? By me? By the life I had worked so hard to build for us? I didn't know how to respond, so I sat there in stunned silence as she excused herself to the bedroom. That word haunted me long after, the idea that what I considered love and stability could feel like a prison to her. At the time, I still clung to hope. I told myself every couple goes through rough patches, that this was just a season of stress and miscommunication. I doubled down on trying to be supportive, offering to take on more chores, planning small surprises, making excuses for her absences. But deep down, the truth was undeniable, something had shifted between us. The warmth was cooling, the laughter fading, and the woman I thought I knew was becoming someone I barely recognized. These were the first warning signs, the subtle tremors before the earthquake, and though I ignored them as best I could, they were already pointing toward the unraveling of everything I held dear. The night everything began to spiral into something I could no longer dismiss as a passing phase started innocuously enough, with Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table flipping through her phone while I washed dishes. The clinking of plates and running water filled the silence between us, a silence that had grown so heavy it felt unnatural. In the past, she would have sat across from me, chatting about her day, teasing me about my clumsy dishwashing skills, or playing some music in the background. But now she sat with her face illuminated by the glow of her screen, barely acknowledging I was there. I remember turning to her and asking softly, "Everything okay?" She didn't look up. "Yeah, just need some space." It wasn't the first time she had used that word, space, but something about the way she said it then felt final, like she had been rehearsing it. My heart sank because I suddenly realized this wasn't about work stress or exhaustion anymore. She was actively pulling away from me, and I had no idea how to bridge the gap. A week later, she finally said the words I had been dreading. We had been sitting in the living room after another tense dinner, the air thick with unspoken grievances. She set her wine glass down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Marcus, I think I need some space from this marriage." My stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't just a request for a night to herself, or a weekend away with friends. She was talking about stepping out of our marriage, detaching herself from me, from us, from everything we had built together. Space? I echoed, my voice cracking slightly despite my effort to remain calm. She nodded, her tone deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Yes. Space. A month, maybe more. I just need to clear my head and figure out what I really want." It felt like a knife plunged into my chest. I had spent months sensing the distance, but to hear her say it out loud broke something inside me. I wanted to plead with her, to remind her of our vows, to ask her if she really understood what she was saying. But all that came out was a hollow laugh. Space? You want space? Fine. Pack your bags tonight. You'll have all the space you need. The words came out harsher than I intended, laced with both pain and anger. Eleanor's eyes widened as though she hadn't expected me to call her bluff so decisively. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. Instead, she stood, disappeared into the bedroom, and returned with a duffel bag half an hour later. Watching her pack was surreal. Every folded shirt, every pair of jeans, every familiar perfume bottle she tossed into that bag felt like a piece of our life being dismantled. I wanted to stop her, to reach out and pull her back into my arms, but I remained frozen, my pride battling with my heartbreak. When she finally walked out the door, suitcase in hand, she paused briefly, almost waiting for me to call her back. But I didn't. I couldn't. My chest was tight, my throat burning, but I forced myself to stay silent. And then she was gone. The click of the door closing behind her was louder than any slam, reverberating in my ears like the end of a chapter one wasn't ready to finish. I sat in the quiet of that empty living room, staring at the half-drunk glass of wine she had left behind, and felt an overwhelming wave of grief crash over me. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, listening to the creaks of the house, replaying her words over and over. I need space from this marriage. They looped in my head, taunting me, making me question everything. What had I done wrong? Was I too safe? Too predictable? Had I failed her as a husband? The days that followed were a blur of confusion and denial. At work, I went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every conversation, every small fight, every moment of coldness that had led us here. At night, the house felt cavernous, the bed too wide, the silence oppressive. Friends noticed my distracted state, but I brushed them off, not ready to share the truth. My sister Camille, however, wasn't so easily fooled. She showed up one evening with groceries, determined to check on me. As she unpacked the bags, she looked at me squarely and asked, "Where's Eleanor?" I hesitated, then finally admitted, she needed space. Camille frowned, clearly unimpressed. Space? Or an escape? I bristled at her bluntness, but deep down, I feared she might be right. Maybe Eleanor wasn't just taking time to clear her head. Maybe she was testing what life without me would feel like. Despite the gnawing fear, part of me still clung to hope. I told myself this was temporary, that she just needed to step back to appreciate what we had. I replayed our happier days like a highlight reel, convincing myself she would eventually remember the warmth, the laughter, the love we once shared. Yet even in my optimism, doubt lingered like a shadow. Why did she need a month? Why couldn't she work through it with me by her side? Why did she have to leave entirely? The questions kept me awake at night, circling endlessly with no answers. I started to notice small details in our home that reminded me of her absence, the empty spot on the dresser where her jewelry box had been, the silence where her laughter should have filled the room, the faint trace of her perfume on the pillowcase that grew fainter each day. It was during those lonely nights that I began to feel the first stirrings of resentment. If she truly loved me, wouldn't she have fought for us instead of walking out? If I meant as much to her as she once claimed, why was she so quick to leave? I wrestled with conflicting emotions, grief, anger, longing, and confusion, all crashing into each other like waves against rock. I still wanted her back, desperately, but I also felt betrayed. She had demanded space, but in doing so, she had left me suffocating in the void she created. And though I didn't know it yet, that void would soon become the very reason I started to change, to reconsider what I truly wanted, and to question whether the woman I had married was the same woman who had just walked out of my life. The days after Eleanor left stretched out endlessly, each one heavier than the last. At first, I convinced myself I needed to give her time and respect her request, but after a week of silence, the isolation began eating at me. The house was too quiet, Meals were tasteless, and the little routines we had built together now seemed absurdly hollow without her presence. Still, I told myself she would come back, that she would walk through that door any moment with tears in her eyes, admitting she had made a mistake. But instead of Eleanor returning, it was my sister Camille who kept appearing, checking in on me with her mix of blunt honesty and sisterly care. One night she showed up with takeout, her eyes narrowing as soon as she stepped inside. "Marcus," she said, dropping the bag on the counter, "you look like you've been dragged through a storm." I sighed and tried to laugh it off, but she wouldn't let me hide. Enough with the tough guy act. What's really going on? I sat down heavily at the table, the weight of my exhaustion pressing on me. She wanted space. A month. Said she needed to figure herself out. Camille raised her eyebrows and crossed her arms. Space? From her husband? Marcus, that's not a marriage. That's someone planning an exit. Her words cut sharper than I expected, and though I wanted to argue, deep down I feared she was right. Camille had always had a way of cutting through illusions. She leaned closer, her voice softer now. You've been holding on for dear life, but maybe it's time to ask yourself why. You deserve someone who actually wants to stay. I bristled at that, still protective of Eleanor even in her absence. She's just confused, I insisted. We've been together for years. People hit rough patches. This doesn't mean she doesn't care. Camille didn't argue further, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. It wasn't only Camille who voiced concern. At work, my friend and coworker Jordan noticed my distracted state. One afternoon, as we sat in the break room nursing coffees, he finally spoke up. You've been spacing out for days, man. What's going on? Reluctantly, I told him the bare bones of the story. He listened without interruption, then whistled low. That doesn't sound like space. That sounds like she's already halfway out the door. I flinched at the bluntness, but he pressed on. Marcus, I don't know much about marriage, but I do know if someone loves you, they don't need to disappear to figure it out. They fight with you, not against you. His words lingered long after I left work that day, echoing in my mind as I walked back into the empty house that used to be filled with warmth. The more I spoke with the people close to me, the more the narrative began to shift in my head. Where I had once clung to hope, their perspectives started chiseling away at my denial. My mother called one evening after Camille had clearly updated her, and her gentle voice carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Marcus, I know you love her, but love has to be mutual. It's not something you can carry alone. I wanted to protest, to defend Eleanor, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud anymore. Each conversation forced me to face the possibility that I had been avoiding. Maybe Eleanor's space wasn't about self-discovery or reflection. Maybe it was her way of testing freedom, of seeing what life looked like without me in it. One Saturday, Camille dragged me out to lunch, claiming I needed fresh air. Over plates of pasta, she leaned across the table and said, "You're stuck in limbo, Marcus. You're waiting for her to come back, but what if she never does? Are you going to waste your life waiting?" Her bluntness stung, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. I stared at her, silent, the question gnawing at me. She was right, I was in limbo. Every day I replayed Eleanor's departure, clinging to the belief she would return, but the truth was I didn't know if she ever intended to. Camille reached out and put a hand on mine. You need to start thinking about yourself. What you want. Not just what you hope she'll decide. Her words felt like a lifeline, though I wasn't sure I was ready to grab hold of it. That night, lying awake in the too-big bed, I thought about everything my family and friends had said. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that Eleanor wasn't coming back, not the Eleanor I had known, at least. Maybe she had already emotionally checked out long before she walked out with her suitcase. The thought gutted me, but it also sparked something new, something fragile but undeniable, a flicker of self-preservation. If she had truly wanted our marriage to work, wouldn't she have fought alongside me instead of walking away? The more I turned it over in my head, the more the truth began to crystallize. I was the only one fighting to save something that might already be gone. In the following days, I began opening up more to the people around me, letting their voices challenge the narrative I had been telling myself. Each conversation added weight to the growing realization that Eleanor's decision wasn't about needing space to grow, it was about leaving without saying goodbye. Jordan told me bluntly, "Man, you've got too much heart to waste it on someone who doesn't want it." My mother reminded me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. And Camille, ever the realist, said simply, "Marcus, you deserve better than being someone's second choice." Their words echoed in the quiet of my empty house, seeping into the cracks of my denial until there was little left of it. Though I wasn't ready to act yet, the shift inside me was undeniable. The support of those who truly cared for me began to peel back the layers of illusion I had wrapped myself in. For the first time since Eleanor had walked out, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. Sadness because I knew the marriage I had cherished might already be gone. Clarity because I was starting to see that holding on might be hurting me more than letting go ever could. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and the longing, a seed of strength began to take root. I didn't yet know what I would do, but I knew this: I couldn't stay frozen forever, waiting for someone who might never come back. The night I finally hit rock bottom was not dramatic, not filled with shouting or slammed doors. It was eerily quiet, almost deceptively ordinary. I had come home late from work, the weight of the day pressing down on me, and walked into the dark, empty house that had become my reality. I flicked on the light, set my keys on the counter, and for the first time truly noticed how lifeless the place felt. There were still faint traces of Eleanor scattered around, an old scarf she had left draped over a chair, a stack of her favorite books collecting dust on the shelf, but instead of comforting me, those remnants felt like ghosts haunting me, reminding me of a life I no longer had. I sank into the couch, staring at nothing, and the silence was deafening. In that moment, I realized how much of myself I had lost waiting for her, holding on to the hope she would return, even though every sign pointed to the opposite. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from her. It wasn't long, just a short line that read, "Hope you're doing okay." My heart lurched, desperate for more, desperate to believe this was the start of her reaching back out. But as I stared at the words, I saw them for what they were: empty. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to reconcile. It was a breadcrumb, just enough to keep me tethered, but not enough to mean anything real. And that was when the truth hit me with brutal clarity: she had already left me in every way that mattered. She wasn't checking on me out of love, she was checking on me out of habit, or maybe guilt. I felt something inside me break then, not a sharp crack, but a slow collapse, the final piece of denial crumbling away. I remember burying my face in my hands, a rush of anger and grief tearing through me all at once. Anger at her for asking for space when what she really wanted was freedom. Anger at myself for pretending otherwise. Grief for the marriage I had clung to long after it had slipped away. I cried harder that night than I had since I was a child, the kind of raw, guttural sobs that left me hollow. And yet, in the middle of that storm of pain, something else emerged, a sense of release. For months I had been carrying the burden of keeping us afloat, convincing myself that if I just waited, if I just endured, she would come back and we would be whole again. But that night, I finally understood: she wasn't coming back, and even if she did, she wouldn't be the same person I had loved. That realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes and an exhaustion that cut deep, but also with a strange clarity. I looked around the house with new eyes. The emptiness was no longer just a void left by her absence, it was a canvas. I could either continue to sit in it, consumed by memories, or I could reclaim it, make it mine again. For the first time, I chose the latter. I got up, opened the windows, and let in the morning air. It was such a small act, but it felt monumental. I began gathering Eleanor's things: the scarf, the books, the little knickknacks she had left behind. With each item I placed in a box, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't about anger or revenge, it was about reclaiming my space, both literally and emotionally. I realized I didn't want to be surrounded by the ghost of what had been. I wanted to make room for what could be. As I worked, Camille called. Her voice was filled with concern, as always, but when I told her what I was doing, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "I'm proud of you, Marcus. That's the first step." Hearing that validation brought tears to my eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of acknowledgement, of recognizing that I was finally choosing myself. After I hung up, I kept packing, each movement steadier than the last. The house still echoed with memories, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It was slowly becoming a place where I could breathe again. Later that week, Eleanor finally called. Her voice on the other end was shaky, as if she had been crying. "Marcus," she said, "I've been thinking, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I do want to come back." For a moment, my heart clenched, the old longing flaring up. This was what I had waited for, what I had prayed for. But then I looked around at the boxes stacked neatly by the door, the sunlight streaming through the open windows, the fresh air I had finally let in, and I realized I didn't want to go back. Not anymore. "Eleanor," I said slowly, carefully, "you asked for space, and I gave it to you. But I found something in that space too, myself. And I don't think I can go back to the way things were." There was silence on the line, followed by a muffled sob. I felt the sting of it, but also the strength in standing my ground. When I hung up, I expected to feel crushed, but instead I felt lighter. It was as if I had been carrying a boulder on my chest and had finally set it down. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for Eleanor to decide my future. I was choosing it myself. That was my rock bottom, but also my turning point. The place where I had nothing left to lose, but everything to gain by letting go. The morning after that final phone call with Eleanor felt different from any morning I had experienced since she left. For months, I had woken with a weight pressing down on my chest, the dread of facing another day in a life that felt empty. But this time, when the sunlight filtered through the blinds and warmed my face, I didn't feel dread, I felt possibility. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but a quiet shift, like the turning of a page. I rose from bed, brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my journal. I hadn't touched it in years, but now, the words flowed onto the page as I wrote about everything I had endured, about the grief, the loneliness, and finally, the clarity I had gained. Writing it down made it real. It was as if I had finally carved meaning out of the chaos. The house, once suffocating in its emptiness, began to take on a new energy. I rearranged furniture, painted over the walls Eleanor had once chosen, and bought a few new pieces that reflected my own taste rather than ours. Each small change was a declaration that I was moving forward, that I was no longer clinging to a past that had let me go long before I admitted it. I even took down the wedding photos, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer wanted to define myself by a bond that had unraveled. Instead, I filled the walls with landscapes I had photographed on trips, reminders of the world outside my grief, the world that was waiting for me if I chose to step into it. Camille visited often during those weeks, and every time she walked in, she noticed the difference. "This place feels alive again," she remarked one Saturday afternoon as we sat on the freshly rearranged couch. I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, not forced, not out of politeness, but genuine. "I feel alive again," I admitted. Saying it out loud was like exhaling a truth I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. Camille squeezed my shoulder, pride shining in her eyes. "I knew you had it in you. Sometimes we just need to be broken open before we can rebuild stronger." Her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments, not as a reminder of pain, but as a testament to resilience. Life slowly began to take shape in new ways. I joined a local hiking group, something I had always wanted to do but never pursued because Eleanor wasn't interested. The first time I trekked up a steep trail and stood at the summit looking out over the valley, the wind whipping through my hair, I felt a surge of exhilaration. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during the marriage, and to my surprise, they welcomed me back with open arms. Laughter returned to my life in small bursts, first awkward, then natural, until it felt like it had never left. Slowly, I began to recognize myself again, not the version of me that was always bending, compromising, and waiting, but the man who had passions, dreams, and worth of his own. As for Eleanor, she tried reaching out a few more times. Each message carried a tone of regret, sometimes veiled, sometimes blatant. There was one in particular that struck me. "I didn't realize how much you meant to me until I was gone." In the past, those words would have undone me, would have made me drop everything to welcome her back. But now, I read them with a strange detachment. I wasn't angry anymore, nor was I desperate. I simply didn't feel the same pull. I had found peace in the space she demanded, peace she never expected me to claim. I realized then that I could wish her well without wanting her back, that I could forgive without forgetting, and that I could move on without bitterness. That was the true freedom I had been waiting for. One evening, after returning from a long hike, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. It struck me how symbolic it felt, the end of one day, the promise of another. The past was behind me, but it had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and more attuned to what I deserved. I thought about the man I had been when Eleanor first asked for space, desperate and afraid, and compared him to the man I was now, steady and resolute. The difference was profound. I no longer defined myself by someone else's choices. I was no longer waiting to be loved, I was already enough on my own. In reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that Eleanor's demand for space, though it broke me at the time, was ultimately a gift in disguise. It forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding, to shed the illusions I had clung to, and to rebuild a life that was authentically mine. If she had never walked out, I might have spent years trapped in a marriage that was eroding me, too blind or too afraid to see it. Instead, I was given the chance to start anew, to rediscover myself, and to grow into someone who would never again accept being an afterthought. That was the lesson I carried forward. Sometimes the very thing that shatters you is what sets you free. To anyone listening, who might be in a place like I was, clinging to something that is already gone, waiting for someone who doesn't truly want to stay, I would say this: love should not leave you begging for scraps. It should not demand your silence, your patience, or your sacrifice while giving you nothing in return. You deserve reciprocity, commitment, and respect. If someone asks for space but uses that space to escape you, let them. Don't chase someone who runs from your love. Instead, use that space to find yourself, to heal, and to rebuild. Because the greatest realization I had through all of this was simple but profound: sometimes the end of one relationship is not the end of love, but the beginning of self-love. And that, above all, is worth holding on to. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.